The emergency broadcast crackled through the radio with a mechanical urgency that made Solara Vesperian's blood run cold. All citizens are advised to evacuate immediately. The infection has breached the northern districts. Repeat, this is not a drill. She pressed her palm against the kitchen window, watching black smoke billow from the direction of downtown Millbrook. Just 3 hours ago, she had kissed her husband Caius goodbye as he left for his construction job, and her children, 15-year-old Lyrian and 8-year-old Ember, had been safely at school. Now the world was ending. The first scream pierced the afternoon air like a blade through silk. Solara's neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, came stumbling out of her house across the street, her floral dress torn and stained with something dark. Behind her, shambling with an unnatural gait, came what had once been her husband. His face was a grotesque mask of decay, his eyes clouded white, and his jaw hung at an impossible angle. Mrs. Holloway's terrified wails echoed through the suburban neighborhood as more figures emerged from houses, twisted parodies of the people Solara had known for years. The infection had arrived in Millbrook. Solara's hands shook as she grabbed her car keys and rushed toward the garage. She had to reach Lyrian and Ember at Riverside Elementary before whatever was happening consumed everything. The engine roared to life, and she backed out of the driveway just as Mrs. Holloway's screams abruptly stopped. In her rearview mirror, Solara saw 2 figures hunched over something in the street, and she pressed the accelerator harder. The roads leading to the school were chaos incarnate. Abandoned cars sat at odd angles, their doors flung open as if their occupants had fled in panic. Emergency vehicles wailed past her, their sirens creating a symphony of desperation. Through her windshield, Solara could see people running in every direction, some carrying suitcases, others clutching children, all of them wearing the same expression of disbelief and terror. A pickup truck slammed into the car ahead of her, sending it spinning into a fire hydrant. Water erupted skyward like a geyser as Solara swerved around the wreckage. In her peripheral vision, she caught sight of movement, a man in a business suit lurching toward the sidewalk with the same unnatural gait she had witnessed in her neighborhood. His briefcase lay forgotten behind him, papers scattered in the wind like fallen leaves. The radio continued its litany of warnings and emergency instructions, but the words blurred together in Solara's mind. All that mattered was reaching her children. She could picture Ember's bright smile and the way she always insisted on braiding Solara's hair before school. She could see Lyrian's serious expression as he helped his little sister with homework, already showing the protective instincts that reminded her so much of Caius. As she turned onto Maple Street, her heart lurched. The elementary school parking lot was a battlefield of abandoned vehicles and broken glass. The front doors hung open, and she could see inside the hallways that should have been filled with children's laughter but now echoed with an eerie silence. A yellow school bus sat sideways across the entrance, its windows shattered and doors hanging like broken wings. Solara parked haphazardly and ran toward the building, calling her children's names. Her voice echoed off empty walls decorated with crayon drawings and construction paper flowers, innocent reminders of the world that had existed just hours before. Room after room revealed the same scene: overturned desks, scattered books, and the unmistakable signs of hasty evacuation. In Ember's classroom, she found a small pink backpack with a unicorn patch, one she had sewn on herself just last week. But no children. No teachers. No signs of where they might have gone. The evacuation announcement crackled over the school's intercom system, an automated loop that had been playing to empty halls. All students and faculty have been relocated to designated safe zones. Please contact emergency services for more information. But the phones were dead. The cell towers had gone dark. And somewhere in this collapsing world, her children were alone and afraid, probably wondering why their mother hadn't come for them. Solara clutched Ember's backpack to her chest and made a promise that would drive her through the hell that was coming. She would find them, no matter how far she had to travel or what horrors she had to face. The dead were walking, civilization was crumbling, but a mother's love was stronger than the apocalypse itself. The evacuation shelter at Jefferson High School had been overrun. Solara discovered this when she arrived to find the gymnasium doors barricaded from the inside with desks and chairs, while dark stains painted the walls in patterns that spoke of violence and desperation. Fresh scratches marked the metal doors, and through a broken window, she could hear the low, guttural moans that had become the soundtrack of humanity's darkest hour. She had spent the previous night huddled in her car in the school parking lot, clutching Ember's unicorn backpack and staring at emergency broadcasts that grew increasingly grim. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Major cities were falling. The military was establishing quarantine zones, but even those were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected. And somewhere in this nightmare, Lyrian and Ember were fighting to survive. The morning sun revealed the true scope of the catastrophe. Bodies lay scattered across the schoolyard, some still, others beginning to stir with that telltale jerky movement. Solara had seen enough in the past 18 hours to understand the rules of this new world. A bite meant death, death meant resurrection, and resurrection meant hunger for human flesh. She needed supplies, weapons, and most importantly, information about where the children might have been taken. The emergency broadcasts had mentioned 3 potential evacuation sites: Fort Morrison Military Base, the Riverside Community Center, and St. Catherine's Hospital. Each was at least 50 miles away, and the roads between were likely crawling with the infected. Her first encounter with the undead came as she attempted to enter the school through a side entrance. The door opened easily, too easily, and she found herself face to face with what had once been Mr. Peterson, the beloved janitor who had always slipped extra cookies to the kindergartners. Now his kind eyes were milky white, his uniform torn and bloodied, and his mouth opened in a soundless scream as he lunged toward her. Instinct took over. Solara swung the tire iron she had taken from her car, connecting with Mr. Peterson's skull with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, finally at peace, and she stood there trembling as the reality of what she had done sank in. She had just killed a man, or what had been a man. The distinction seemed important, though she couldn't quite grasp why. The school's interior was a maze of overturned furniture and scattered personal belongings. In the principal's office, she found a map marked with evacuation routes and emergency protocols. According to the documentation, children from elementary schools had been prioritized for transport to Fort Morrison, the most secure of the 3 locations. It was also the farthest away, requiring her to cross through downtown Millbrook, now likely a death trap of epic proportions. But she also found something else in the office, fresh writing on the whiteboard. Kids taken to Riverside Center Day 1 was scrawled in red marker, along with a list of names. Solara's heart pounded as she scanned the list, and there, halfway down, she saw them: Lyrian Vesperian, Ember Vesperian. They were alive. Or at least, they had been alive when this list was made. The Riverside Community Center was only 30 miles away, a journey that would have taken 40 minutes in the old world. Now, it might as well have been on the moon. She gathered what supplies she could find: a first aid kit, some energy bars from the teacher's lounge, and a flashlight, before making her way back to her car. The drive through Millbrook's residential district was like navigating through a war zone. Houses stood empty with their front doors hanging open, their former occupants either fled, dead, or wandering the streets with that characteristic shuffle. Solara drove slowly, trying to avoid the abandoned cars and debris that littered the roads. Every shadow could hide danger, every movement in her peripheral vision could signal an attack. Near the town square, she encountered her first horde. At least 30 infected individuals had gathered around an overturned ice cream truck, attracted by the electronic melody that continued to play on an endless loop. They moved as a group, their heads turning in unison when her engine noise caught their attention. Solara pressed the accelerator and took a sharp right turn, tires squealing as she put distance between herself and the gathering. As she reached the outskirts of town, Solara allowed herself a moment of hope. The roads ahead looked clearer, and the Riverside Community Center was marked on her map with a red circle. Lyrian and Ember were waiting for her there, she could feel it in her bones. Her children were survivors, just like their mother. But in her rearview mirror, she could see smoke rising from Millbrook, and she knew that the world she had known was gone forever. Whatever lay ahead would test every ounce of strength, courage, and determination she possessed. Yet as she drove toward an uncertain future, Solara held on to the one truth that gave her purpose: nothing would stop her from reaching her children. Nothing. The Riverside Community Center stood like a fortress against the dying light, its windows boarded up and vehicles arranged in a defensive perimeter around the building. But as Solara approached, her heart sank. Fresh tire tracks led away from the compound in multiple directions, and the main gate hung open, revealing an empty courtyard littered with abandoned supplies and personal belongings. She was too late. Solara sat in her car for several minutes, fighting back the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. The list at the school had been dated 3 days ago. Anything could have happened since then. The evacuation site could have been overrun, or the survivors might have moved on to another location. Her children could be anywhere, or worse, they might not be anywhere at all. A tap on her passenger window made her jump. A man stood beside her car, his clothes torn and dirty but his eyes alert and intelligent. He appeared to be in his 40s, with graying hair and a face that bore the weight of recent trauma. Most importantly, he didn't display the telltale signs of infection. His movements were fluid and purposeful, his gaze focused and aware. "You're wasting time sitting here," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. "They moved out yesterday morning. Headed for the military checkpoint at Mill Ridge." Solara rolled down her window cautiously, keeping her tire iron within reach. "Who moved out? Was there a group of children? Did you see?" "About 40 survivors, including maybe a dozen kids," the man interrupted. "I'm Thaddeus Grimwald, by the way. Former paramedic, current expert in staying alive when the world goes to hell." He gestured toward the abandoned community center. "They left because a horde was approaching from the east. Big one, maybe 300 infected. The military escorts decided it wasn't defensible." Hope flickered in Solara's chest like a candle in the wind. "My children, Lyrian and Ember Vesperian. Did you see them?" Thaddeus studied her face carefully before nodding. Teenager with dark hair, kept close to a little girl with pigtails. "Yeah, I saw them." The boy was protective of his sister, wouldn't let her out of his sight. "Smart kid." He paused, his expression growing serious. "But Mill Ridge is a 3-day journey on foot, and it's not exactly a pleasure cruise. The roads are crawling with infected, and there are other dangers too." "Other dangers?" "Survivors who've decided that compassion is a luxury they can't afford," Thaddeus said grimly. "Groups that take what they want and kill anyone who gets in their way. The dead aren't the only monsters in this new world." Solara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. But the knowledge that Lyrian and Ember were alive, that they were with a group of other survivors, gave her strength. "Will you help me get to Mill Ridge?" Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the appraising look of someone who had learned to judge people quickly and accurately. "What makes you think I'm heading in that direction?" "Because you're here instead of running in the opposite direction," Solara said. "And because you have that look in your eyes, the same one I see in the mirror. You're looking for someone too." He smiled then, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. "My daughter Nissa. She was working at the hospital when this all started. If she made it out, she would have headed for the military checkpoint." He opened the passenger door and slid into the seat beside her. "Besides, traveling alone is suicide. 2 people watch each other's backs, cover more ground, and have a better chance of making it through the worst parts." As if summoned by his words, a group of infected emerged from behind the community center building. They moved with the relentless shuffle that had become so terrifyingly familiar, their attention drawn by the sound of voices and the idling engine. At the front of the group, Solara recognized Mrs. Henderson, who had taught Sunday school at the local church. Her floral dress was now stained with blood, and her gentle face had been transformed into a mask of mindless hunger. "Time to go," Thaddeus said calmly, but Solara could hear the tension in his voice. She put the car in drive and pulled away from the community center as more infected emerged from the surrounding buildings. In her side mirror, she watched them converge on the spot where her car had been, their movements synchronized like a school of deadly fish following the scent of prey. "The main roads are too dangerous," Thaddeus said, studying a map he had pulled from his backpack. "Too many choke points, too many places for ambushes. But I know some back roads that might get us there safely, assuming we can avoid the worst of the herds." As they drove into the gathering darkness, Solara felt a mixture of fear and determination coursing through her veins. She was no longer alone in this hellish landscape, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she had a clear destination and a realistic plan. Lyrian and Ember were 3 days away, traveling with a group that included military escorts. But 3 days in this new world felt like a lifetime, and every mile between her and her children was fraught with dangers that could end her journey before it truly began. Still, as the miles passed beneath their wheels, Solara clung to the image of her children's faces and the promise she had made in that empty classroom. She would find them. Against all odds, she would find them. The abandoned gas station materialized out of the pre-dawn mist like a ghost from the old world. Its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls told the story of civilization's rapid collapse, but to Solara and Thaddeus, it represented something far more precious: shelter and the possibility of fuel for their increasingly desperate journey. They had been driving for 18 hours, taking turns at the wheel while the other kept watch for the infected hordes that roamed the highways like predatory packs. Their fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and the back roads that Thaddeus had chosen were becoming increasingly treacherous as abandoned vehicles and debris forced them into longer detours. "Stay in the car," Thaddeus whispered, checking the makeshift spear he had fashioned from a mop handle and a kitchen knife. "I'll check if the pumps are functional." But as he approached the station, a figure stumbled out from behind the building. At first glance, it appeared to be another infected, clothes torn, movement unsteady, face obscured by matted hair. Then the figure called out in a distinctly human voice, "Please, help me." It was a woman, probably in her 30s, with a deep gash across her forehead and her left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. She moved with the careful steps of someone fighting through severe pain, not the relentless shuffle of the undead. Behind her, Solara could see drag marks in the dirt. She had been crawling until recently. "It could be a trap," Thaddeus said, but his voice lacked conviction. His medical training was clearly warring with his survival instincts. The woman collapsed to her knees near the gas pumps, and Solara could see tears streaming down her dirt-stained face. "My name is Nissa Blackthorn," she gasped. I was with a group. They left me behind when I got hurt." Thaddeus froze at the name. "Nissa? My God, Nissa, is that really you?" The reunion was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Father and daughter embraced while Solara kept watch, scanning the horizon for signs of danger. Nissa's story came out in fragments. She had indeed been at the hospital when the outbreak began, had escaped with a group of medical personnel, and had been traveling toward Mill Ridge when her group was attacked by bandits. In the chaos, she had suffered a broken arm and a head injury, and her companions had made the brutal decision to leave her behind rather than risk their own lives helping someone who might slow them down. The group with the children, Solara pressed gently. "Did you see them?" Nissa nodded weakly. 2 days ago. They passed through Millfield. The kids looked scared but healthy. There was a boy who kept his arm around the little girl. "That's them," Solara breathed. "How far is Millfield from here?" "Maybe 8 hours by car, if the roads are clear," Nissa said. "But they won't be. The bandits who attacked us, they've set up roadblocks. They're taking supplies, weapons, anything valuable. And if you can't pay their toll..." She shuddered, leaving the implications unspoken. Thaddeus was already improvising a splint for his daughter's arm using materials from their medical kit. "We'll have to go around them. Add another day to our journey, but it's better than walking into an ambush." As if the universe wanted to test their resolve, the sound of engines echoed across the empty landscape. 3 motorcycles appeared on the horizon, approaching fast with rooster tails of dust marking their passage. Even from a distance, Solara could see that the riders were armed and moved with the aggressive confidence of predators who had found easy prey. "Into the station, now," Thaddeus commanded, helping Nissa to her feet. They took cover behind the service counter as the motorcycles circled the building like wolves around wounded deer. The riders wore mismatched military gear and makeshift armor, their faces hidden behind bandanas and sunglasses. The leader, a giant of a man with arms covered in crude tattoos, climbed off his bike and approached the station with casual arrogance. "We know you're in there," he called out, his voice carrying the accent of someone who had never learned to fear consequences. "Name's Kieran Voss, and this here's our territory. You want to pass through, you pay the toll. You want to cause trouble, well?" He chambered a round in his rifle with theatrical precision. Solara's mind raced through their options. They had limited ammunition, an injured woman to protect, and vehicles that needed fuel to continue their journey. Fighting seemed impossible, but surrender might mean death, or worse. But Thaddeus had other ideas. "I'm a doctor," he called out, his voice steady despite their desperate situation. "I've got medical supplies, antibiotics, painkillers. Worth more than whatever cash or weapons you think we're carrying." There was a long pause as Kieran considered this. In a world where medical care could mean the difference between life and death, a trained paramedic with supplies was indeed valuable. "Show yourself, Doc. Hands where I can see them." What followed was a tense negotiation that felt like it lasted hours but probably took only minutes. Thaddeus traded half their medical supplies for safe passage and enough gasoline to reach Millfield. It was a steep price, but it bought them something more precious than gold, time to continue their search. As the bikers disappeared into the distance with their payment, Solara felt a mixture of relief and determination. They had faced their first major test and survived. Nissa was alive and reunited with her father. And somewhere ahead, Lyrian and Ember were still fighting their own battles against the chaos that had consumed the world. The road to Mill Ridge stretched before them, filled with unknown dangers and impossible choices. But they were no longer just three desperate individuals running from the apocalypse, they were a family forged by circumstance, bound together by love and mutual dependence. And that, Solara thought as they pulled back onto the highway, might just be enough to see them through the hell that awaited. The town of Millfield had been beautiful once. Solara could see evidence of its former charm in the Victorian houses that lined Main Street, their gingerbread trim and wraparound porches speaking of quieter times when the biggest worry was whether the annual harvest festival would have good weather. Now those same houses stood as monuments to humanity's failure, their windows shattered, their doors hanging open like wounds in the landscape. But it was the silence that truly unsettled her. After days of navigating around hordes of infected, the absence of moaning, shuffling feet, and decomposing flesh felt almost supernatural. Millfield wasn't abandoned, it was cleansed, and that raised questions that made Solara's skin crawl. "Something's wrong here," Thaddeus muttered from the driver's seat, unconsciously echoing her thoughts. In the back seat, Nissa dozed fitfully, her fever having broken during the night but leaving her weak and disoriented. They found the answer to Millfield's eerie quietude at the town square. Bodies lay in neat rows, each with a single bullet wound to the head. Men, women, children, and scattered among them, the corpses of infected individuals. Someone had executed the entire population, making no distinction between the living and the undead. "Military checkpoint," Thaddeus said grimly, pointing to tire tracks and the scattered remains of an army supply truck. "They came through here, found the town overrun, and decided it was easier to kill everyone than to sort out who was infected and who wasn't." Solara felt her world tilt on its axis. If the military was executing civilians, what did that mean for the refugee groups they were escorting? What did it mean for Lyrian and Ember? "We need to find out where they went," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to know what happened to the children." They found their answer in the abandoned military camp on the outskirts of town. Hastily erected barriers surrounded a collection of olive-green tents, and in the center, a communications array still crackled with distant radio chatter. But more importantly, they found records, manifests of refugees, evacuation orders, and a detailed log of military activities in the region. The truth was worse than Solara had imagined. According to the documents, the refugee convoy containing Lyrian and Ember had arrived in Millfield 3 days earlier. But instead of continuing to Mill Ridge as planned, they had been detained for health screening and threat assessment. The children had been separated from the adults and placed in a secure facility called Haven Point, which according to the maps was a former juvenile detention center 20 miles north of their current location. But the most damning evidence came in the form of radio transcripts between Haven Point and Regional Command. The facility's commander, a Colonel Thorne, had requested permission to implement Protocol 7 for all juvenile detainees. The response from his superiors was chillingly bureaucratic. Protocol 7 authorized. Minimal resources to be allocated for non-essential personnel. Thaddeus found the protocol descriptions in a military handbook left behind in one of the tents. Protocol 7 was code for termination of individuals deemed high risk for infection or sedition. In plain language, it meant execution. "They're going to kill them," Solara said, the words falling from her lips like stones. "They're going to kill all of the children." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Solara found a spark of something else in the darkness: rage. Pure, incandescent fury at a system that would murder innocents in the name of expediency. At officials who would look at her children and see nothing but potential threats to be eliminated. "Haven Point is a fortress," Thaddeus said, studying the facility blueprints they had discovered. "Concrete walls, guard towers, electronic security. It was designed to keep dangerous juveniles in, now it's keeping innocent children in while they wait to die." "Then we break them out," Solara said simply. "With what army?" Thaddeus gestured to their meager supplies and weapons. "There are probably 50 soldiers stationed there, not to mention automated defenses. It's suicide." But Nissa, who had been quiet during their discovery, spoke up from where she lay on a medical cot. "Not if we have inside help." She struggled to sit up, her face pale but determined. "Before I got hurt, I was part of a resistance network. Medical personnel who refused to go along with some of the military's more extreme orders. There's a doctor at Haven Point, Marcus Ashford. He's been sending coded messages about what's happening there. If we can get word to him." It was a desperate plan born of desperation, but it was the only chance they had. Using the military radio equipment, Nissa managed to establish contact with Dr. Ashford at Haven Point. The conversation was brief and conducted in medical terminology that would sound innocuous to anyone monitoring the transmission, but the message was clear: they were coming, and they needed his help to save the children. As they prepared to leave Millfield, Solara took one last look at the bodies in the town square. In a few hours, she would be attempting something that rational people would call impossible: infiltrating a military detention facility to rescue her children from execution. The odds of success were virtually non-existent, and the chances of survival were even smaller. But as she climbed into their vehicle and checked her weapon one final time, Solara knew that she had no choice. Somewhere in that concrete fortress, Lyrian and Ember were waiting for her. They probably believed she was dead, that no one was coming to save them from the nightmare their world had become. They were wrong. Their mother was coming, and she was bringing hell with her. Haven Point loomed ahead like a medieval castle reimagined for the modern age, its walls casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. Inside those walls, Protocol 7 was scheduled to be implemented at dawn. Solara had 6 hours to prove that a mother's love was stronger than military protocol, more powerful than institutionalized fear, and more dangerous than any weapon in the government's arsenal. The final battle for her family was about to begin. The abandoned quarry overlooked Haven Point like a scar in the earth, its jagged edges providing perfect cover for 3 desperate people preparing to assault what was essentially a military prison. Through her binoculars, Solara counted 12 guards visible on the perimeter, with at least twice that number likely inside the facility. The children's barracks sat in the center of the compound like a concrete island surrounded by a sea of razor wire and armed sentries. Dr. Marcus Ashford had been as good as his word. During their radio contact, he had provided crucial intelligence about guard rotations, security protocols, and most importantly, the location where Lyrian, Ember, and the other children were being held. He had also confirmed Solara's worst fears: Protocol 7 was scheduled for implementation at dawn, giving them less than 8 hours to mount their rescue. "The medical wing is here," Nissa said, pointing to a blueprint they had sketched based on Ashford's information. Despite her injuries, she had insisted on being part of the assault team. Ashford will create a distraction by triggering the fire suppression system in the main building. That should draw most of the guards away from the children's quarters. Thaddeus checked his watch, a nervous habit he had developed since reuniting with his daughter. The guard rotation changes at midnight. We'll have maybe 15 minutes when they're at their most vulnerable, when the night shift is getting settled and the day shift is focused on getting to their bunks. Solara studied the fortress that held her children, memorizing every detail, every potential obstacle between her and the people she loved most in the world. The concrete walls seemed impossibly high, the guard towers like medieval battlements designed to repel invaders. But she had faced the walking dead, survived encounters with murderous bandits, and witnessed the collapse of civilization itself. A few soldiers and some concrete weren't going to stop her now. "There's something else," Nissa said quietly. "Ashford mentioned that some of the children have been selected for transfer tomorrow. They're being moved to a research facility where they'll be used for medical experiments. Tests to see how the infection spreads, how long it takes to turn, that sort of thing." The words hit Solara like a physical blow. Not only were her children scheduled for execution, but some of them might face an even worse fate as unwilling test subjects in humanity's desperate search for answers about the plague that had destroyed their world. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the fire alarms began wailing inside Haven Point. Emergency lights bathed the compound in harsh red light as soldiers rushed toward the main administrative building, where smoke was beginning to pour from the ventilation systems. Ashford's distraction was working perfectly, drawing defenders away from the children's quarters just as planned. Moving with practiced stealth, the three rescuers approached the eastern wall where the guard presence was lightest. Thaddeus used a pair of bolt cutters to create an opening in the chain-link fence while Solara kept watch for patrols. Every second felt like an eternity as they worked their way closer to the barracks where the children were being held. The building itself was a study in institutional brutality, windowless concrete walls, steel doors with electronic locks, and surveillance cameras at every corner. But Dr. Ashford had been thorough in his preparation. The cameras had been disabled, the electronic locks reprogrammed to accept his medical access card, and the few guards who remained had been called away to deal with the emergency in the main building. Inside the children's quarters, Solara found a scene that would haunt her dreams forever. 43 children ranging in age from 6 to 16 sat on metal bunks in a room designed for half that number. Their faces bore the hollow expression of people who had given up hope, who had accepted that death was coming and there was nothing they could do to stop it. And there, in the far corner, she saw them. Lyrian sat on a lower bunk with his arm around Ember, who was curled against his side like she used to do during thunderstorms when she was little. Both of them looked thinner than she remembered, their clothes dirty and torn, but they were alive and unharmed. When Lyrian saw her, his face went through a series of emotions: disbelief, joy, hope, and finally determination. "Mom?" Ember's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make this moment disappear like a dream. The reunion was brief but intense. Solara gathered her children in her arms, breathing in their familiar scent and feeling their heartbeats against her chest. For a moment, the concrete walls and armed guards seemed to fade away, leaving only the three of them in a bubble of love and relief. But reality reasserted itself quickly. They had to move fast before the distraction ended and the guards returned. Working systematically, they began evacuating the children through the hole in the fence, with Thaddeus and Nissa leading groups to safety while Solara helped organize the escape from inside the barracks. Everything was going according to plan until they encountered the one variable they hadn't accounted for, Colonel Thorne himself, making a surprise inspection of the facility. He appeared in the doorway of the children's quarters with two armed soldiers, his face a mask of professional calm as he surveyed the escape in progress. "I was wondering when someone would try this," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Dr. Ashford's fire alarm was clever, but not quite clever enough. "Stand down, all of you, or I'll order my men to open fire." Solara found herself facing an impossible choice. Surrender meant death for everyone in the room. Resistance might save some of the children, but it would almost certainly result in casualties among the innocents she was trying to protect. It was Lyrian who provided the solution. Moving with the quick reflexes of youth, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and triggered it directly into the colonel's face. The sudden blast of white powder created chaos and confusion, giving the remaining children precious seconds to escape through the breach in the wall. But as they ran toward freedom, Solara could hear alarm sirens beginning to wail throughout the compound. Their time was up, and the real battle was just beginning. The escape from Haven Point became a running battle through the darkness, with searchlights sweeping the landscape like malevolent eyes and the sound of pursuing vehicles growing closer with each passing minute. Solara ran with Ember in her arms while Lyrian stayed close beside them, his young face set in lines of determination that reminded her painfully of his father. Behind them, the other children scattered into the night under the guidance of Thaddeus and Nyssa, each group taking a different route toward the rendezvous point they had established at the abandoned quarry. Dr. Ashford had paid the ultimate price for his assistance. Through the radio chatter that crackled from pursuing military vehicles, they learned that he had been executed immediately after Colonel Thorne discovered his role in the escape. His sacrifice had given them the chance they needed, but it came at a cost that weighed heavily on Solara's conscience as they fled through the pre-dawn darkness. The quarry provided temporary shelter, but they all knew it was only a matter of time before search teams found them. Haven Point's resources were limited, but Colonel Thorne struck Solara as the type of man who would take their escape as a personal insult requiring immediate retribution. They had perhaps an hour before helicopters and tracking dogs would make their hiding place untenable. "There's an old mine shaft about 5 miles north," Thaddeus said, studying a geological survey map by flashlight. "It connects to a network of tunnels that could get us past the military search perimeter. But it's dangerous, unstable, prone to cave-ins, and probably full of infected who wandered in looking for shelter." It wasn't much of a choice, but it was the only option they had. The group of rescued children had grown to 37 souls, ranging from Ember's 8 years to teenagers like Lyrian who were old enough to understand the true gravity of their situation. Some were injured, others traumatized by weeks of imprisonment and the knowledge that they had been scheduled for execution. All of them looked to the adults for guidance and hope. The journey to the mine entrance was a nightmare of careful movement through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and spirits in equal measure. Several times they had to take cover as military aircraft passed overhead, their searchlights turning the landscape into a deadly game of hide and seek. But somehow, impossibly, they reached the abandoned mining operation without losing anyone. The mine itself was exactly as dangerous as Thaddeus had predicted. The main shaft descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams, and the air carried the distinct odor of decay and standing water. Worse, they could hear sounds echoing from the depths, the unmistakable moans and shuffling footsteps that meant infected had indeed taken refuge in the tunnels. "We go together or not at all," Solara said, addressing the group of children who clustered around her like frightened birds. "Stay close, stay quiet, and remember that we've all survived worse than this. We're going to make it through." The underground journey became a test of endurance and courage that pushed everyone to their limits. They encountered infected in the tunnels, former miners and recent refugees who had sought shelter in the darkness only to become part of the hungry dead. But they also discovered something unexpected, other survivors who had created a small community in the deeper parts of the mine system. Led by a former geology professor named Elena Ravencrest, this underground settlement had become a haven for people fleeing the increasingly authoritarian military response to the crisis. They had established growing chambers for food, purification systems for water, and most importantly, a radio network that connected them to other survivor communities across the region. It was through this network that Solara learned the truth about the wider world. The infection was finally being contained in major population centers, but the cure had come at a terrible price. Martial law was now permanent, with anyone deemed non-essential subject to termination or forced labor. Children were particular targets, seen as resources to be controlled rather than people to be protected. But there was hope as well. Communities like Elena's were forming across the country, connected by a network of people who refused to accept that humanity's survival required the abandonment of humanity's soul. They were building something new from the ashes of the old world, something that valued compassion over efficiency, cooperation over control. Solara made her decision without hesitation. This underground community would become their new home, at least temporarily. Lyrian and Ember would be safe here, surrounded by people who saw them as precious children rather than potential threats. And perhaps, when the current crisis passed, they might all emerge into a world that had learned from its mistakes. The reunion with Caius came 6 months later, when Elena's network managed to locate him working in a labor camp in the Eastern Territories. His escape and journey to the underground community was its own epic tale of survival and determination, but when he finally held his family again in the lamplight of their subterranean home, it felt like the end of one story and the beginning of another. As Solara watched Ember teaching letters to some of the younger children and Lyrian helping with the hydroponic gardens that fed their community, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had set out to find her children in a world gone mad, and in doing so, she had helped create something that might outlast the madness itself, a place where love was stronger than fear, where protecting the innocent was more important than following orders. The surface world still struggled with the aftermath of the plague and the authoritarian response that had followed. But deep underground, in chambers carved from living rock, a different kind of civilization was taking root. One child at a time, one family at a time, one choice at a time. Against all odds, they had not just survived, they had built something worth surviving for. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when Ember curled against her side just like she had during those first terrible nights of the apocalypse, Solara allowed herself to believe that perhaps the darkness hadn't won after all. Perhaps, in their small corner of a broken world, the light was finally beginning to return. The journey was over, but the story of what they would build together was just beginning.